First of all, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Mitchell Silver. I'm a member of the Boston Workers Circle. This is the fourth in a series of panel discussions that's jointly sponsored by the Boston Workers Circle and the Islamic Council of New England. The series is entitled Building a Better Future for Palestinians and Israelis. In the first three discussions, we asked the speakers to address whether we, Jews, Muslims, and really all those who are passionate about this issue, interested in the situation. First of all, can we talk to each other across communities and across political divides? Secondly, whether we can acknowledge the story that emerges from truly listening to each other and the story that emerges from other people's experiences, and whether there's a way that this land, which is of deep religious and historical significance to both peoples, whether there's a way to share it, whether that's possible. I think behind these questions is an assumption that I believe is held in common by all of the panelists tonight and in the past three sessions, and probably by the vast majority of the audience for this series. And that assumption is that the current situation is morally unacceptable and politically unsustainable. Tonight's discussion is about what can be done, especially by American activists, to end the ongoing moral disaster and to escape the fast approaching political cataclysm. Our two speakers' work make them very well suited to address these questions. I'm going to give their brief bios now. You can get a more extensive bio on the Boston Workers Circle website. Nidal Al-Azraq is the executive director of 3 for 1, a US-based organization that focuses on water, food, health, environmental work, and education in Palestinian refugee camps throughout the West Bank. He was born and raised in Palestine in the Ida refugee camp in Bethlehem, the West Bank. He's a Palestinian. He earned his bachelor's degree with honors from Harvard Extension School and has been involved for over 15 years in working with young Palestinian refugees in the Laji Center, a West Bank youth organization in the Ida refugee camp, for which he was the administrative director from 2003 through 2006. He has collaborated on film documentaries and co-authored award-winning adult and children's books, all aimed at promoting human rights, empowerment, and political education projects among West Bank Palestinians, especially among Palestinian refugees. Rabbi Jill Jacobs is the CEO of Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, an organization that trains and mobilizes more than 2,000 rabbis and cantors and their communities to bring a moral voice to protecting and advancing human rights in North America, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. She is the author of books that focus on the role of justice in Jewish tradition and the enhancing of justice in the Jewish community. She was ordained by and holds a master's in Talmud from the Jewish Theological Seminary, a master's in urban affairs from Hunter College, and a bachelor's from Columbia University. Rabbi Jacobs has been named the Forward's list of 50 influential American Jews, to Newsweek's list of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, and to the Jerusalem Post 2013 list of women to watch. The titles of their books and more about their accomplishments is in the bios at the Boston Workers Circle website. Before turning to Rabbi Jacobs for the initial presentation, I want to say a little bit about this evening's format. Both our speakers will be given an initial presentation. I want to leave us lots of times for discussion, so I'm going to risk being rude, and after they go much beyond 10 minutes, I'll ask them to wrap up. Then Rabbi Jacobs and Mr. Al-Azraq will have a conversation shaped by questions they and I see as being raised by their presentations. The final portion of tonight's program will be informed by what we hope will be a representative selection of questions submitted by you. And you can submit your questions in the Q&A, which should be at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Rabbi Jacobs to start us off. Rabbi Jacobs?
Thank you so much, Mitchell, and thank you to the Islamic Council of New England and to the Boston Workers Circle for hosting what I understand has been really a fantastic series of events. And I just love this format. I love that you're opening up these conversations, and thank you to everybody for being here. I'll just say a word about Truah, and then I want to talk about some of the ways that we can think about the situation on the ground and what we can do. So Truah, as some of you know, is an organization that mobilizes more than 2,300 rabbis across the US and Canada to work on human rights issues, both at home and also in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So we work here in the US and Canada because this is where we live, and we also work on human rights for both Israelis and Palestinians because as Jews and as rabbis, we have special commitments to Israel and also obligations for what happens there. So I mentioned that Truah is a human rights organization, and to me that's really crucial, that very often conversations about Israel and Palestine start with politics or theory or grand theories or arguing about what should be in the future or what should happen in the past and who was at fault. And trust me, there's plenty of, you can sit around arguing about who's to blame, but that actually misses the real point, which is that what's most important are the human beings who live there. So both Israelis and Palestinians, we have two peoples living there. Nobody is going anywhere. Nobody is magically moving to some other country or disappearing or anything else. So we need to start with the human beings who are there and understand that what is most important is guaranteeing the human rights of every single person in that region. So that includes Israelis, so the roughly 9 million Israelis, 80% of whom or so are Jewish, and the other 20% of whom are primarily Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the 5 million or so Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So all of those 14 million or however many people, every single person has the right to basic human rights. You get human rights by virtue of being born and being human. That's all it takes. You don't have to earn them. You don't get them because you have a good government. You don't get them because of who you voted for. All you have to do is be born and be human. And then you should be, according to international law, guaranteed certain basic human rights. Those human rights include the right to self-determination, freedom of movement, the right to citizenship in a country, basic health and security needs, access to clean water, which I know that we're going to hear a lot more about from Nidal later. So basic human rights, which every single person in that region, just by virtue of being human, deserves. And so we need to start there, and we need to ask ourselves the question of how do we get to a point where every single person in that region has basic human rights. So sometimes, as I said, we get stuck in the theory or like what should be or what the configuration is, but we really have to start with that human rights perspective. We also have the situation that we have two different people who both have different national claims and claims to self-determination that sometimes come up against each other. And so, Truah, just so you know where we position ourselves, we support a two-state solution. We think that is the most likely solution that's going to get to a situation where both people can live out their national aspirations. There's conversations about whether that's with a hard border or a soft border, like an EU confederation model. We can talk about that, but that's where we land, that two states is the way to ensure that both national aspirations can be achieved. Now, I said that I don't want to get stuck in history, that very often conversations are about like what happened 50 years ago and 70 years ago and thousands of years ago, and just arguing about all of the history. So I do want to start with what is happening to human beings right now, but it doesn't mean we can ignore the history. And I do believe that in order to move forward with Israelis and Palestinians moving toward hopefully a solution that guarantees everybody's human rights, that there is also going to have to be some kind of a truth and reconciliation process, that for Israelis, that means acknowledging what happened during what Palestinians call the Nakba, what Israelis call the War of Independence, when some 700,000 Palestinians became refugees, and when approximately 1% of the Jewish population at the time was killed. So there has to be a process for Israelis to be able to acknowledge that to really come to terms with what the creation of the state of Israel meant for Palestinians. And there has to be a process by which Palestinians also understand the fear and pain of Israelis. I'll say that in this situation, I just want to be clear that as the occupying power, Israel does have more responsibility, but there is ultimately going to have to be a process that includes everybody. So I want to talk a little bit about what Trua does and in some of the ways that we have intervened to make, I think, concrete change, or at least to move toward making a positive change in the region. So first, we talk about ourselves as a moral voice. We bring the moral voice of more than 2,300 rabbis to human rights. And that moral voice is crucial. Very often, it's the voices of religious leaders, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, etc., that can cut through some of the political back and forth and can say that we're actually speaking out of morals and ethics. We've heard, in fact, that voices like ours, when we brought together more than 800 rabbis to write a letter opposing annexation, that was part of the pressure that forced the Israeli government to back off annexation. That when we brought rabbis to consulates to both the US and Canadian, both the Israeli embassy in both the US and Canada, and also to all of the consulates in the United States to at a point when Israel was going to expel African asylum seekers, we heard from some of our partners in Israel that pressure, the fact that every consulate and every embassy got a visit from rabbis, was part of the pressure that also forced Israel to back off of that plan. I'll talk about some of the other areas where we work. One, if any of you were reading the New York Times Magazine this past weekend, or you could still find it online, you read a story about rabbinical students' perspectives on Israel and the ways in which rabbinical students now are thinking about Israel. And in that story, it mentions that Trua runs a year-long program for rabbinical students who are doing their academic year in Israel. It's a requirement of most of the major rabbinical schools, the non-Orthodox schools at least, that students spend their first, second, or third year in Israel. And we run a program for those students during that year where once a month we'll take them to see something on the ground. They will go and plant trees with Palestinians in the West Bank to replace trees that were uprooted by settlers. They will go to Hebron with Breaking the Silence, which is a group of Israeli veterans who speak about their experience. They'll go and meet with Mizrahi Jewish activists, so Jews whose families came from North Africa and the Arab world, to hear about their experiences and some of the issues they're working on in their community. They'll meet with Bedouin citizens of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll see what the situation is on the ground, and they also meet human rights leaders, Israeli and Palestinian human rights leaders and civil society leaders who are working to make their own countries and their own lives and their own families, their own children's lives better. And at this point, more than every year, like I said, every year there's a group of rabbinical students who's there from all of the seminaries. And at this point, more than 80% of those students who are there in any given year are part of our program. So that means that if you are going to hire a new rabbi who's just getting ordained this year or last year or next year, that there's an 80% chance that that new rabbi has been to the West Bank with us, has explored human rights with us, has learned skills for telling those stories in their own communities, can talk with a moral voice about the situation on the ground. So over the last 9 years, more than 200 rabbinical students, and now many of them are already ordained, and cantorial students and now cantors have come through that program. The second piece I want to talk about is that a few years ago, Trua started asking questions about the Jewish National Fund US, which as anybody who grew up in a Jewish community knows that you put coins in the blue boxes to plant trees in Israel. And we started asking questions about where the money was actually going, and specifically how much of it was going into the settlements. At the time, we had anecdotal evidence that some of that money coming through JNF USA was being invested in settlements. We didn't actually have numbers. And we ran a campaign where we had rabbis and congregants and lots of people around the country calling their local JNF offices to ask for that information. And as a result, JNF started publishing that list. You can find it if you're the kind of person who likes to look up 990s. It's now included in their 990 every single year because of that pressure we put on them. And actually their funding in the settlements has decreased over the last few years. And the third piece that I want to mention that we've done is that we learned that there were a number of US-based nonprofit, US-based foundations that were putting money into some of the most extreme groups in Israel. So a lot of this money went to a group called Lahava, which is a essentially extremist, terrorist, even group. 3 young people connected to Lahava were just arrested yesterday or the day before for terrorism, for planning a terrorist attack. So they're a violent organization that attacks mostly Palestinians and also Israeli leftist activists. And there's been many attempts in Israel to ban them as a terrorist organization. It has not worked. But we knew that there were a few groups in the United States where money was coming to, in various complicated ways, was getting to Lahava. And so we've, over the past number of years, we've complained to the IRS several times about these foundations. Unfortunately, the IRS hasn't taken very much action, but we do know that they at least temporarily shut down the flow of money to one particular organization that was giving financial support to Israelis who were convicted of terrorism. So those are some of the concrete impact that we've had. And again, I want to go back to the moral voice, which we just can't dismiss, that often the moral voice of religious leaders is what can cut through some of the political noise. Let me just, maybe I'll just say 2 more things about what we all could do, because I know that's the theme of tonight. I think that the most important people to invest in are the people who are doing the work on the ground. So both Israeli and Palestinian human rights and civil society leaders who are increasingly under attack. Many of us saw that Israel used at best dubious information to accuse 6 major Palestinian human rights organizations of being terrorist organizations. There's a big international outcry that we were a part of, as well as some legal work that's happening inside of Israel to stop that designation. And so it's really important, the people who are doing the work on the ground, both Palestinians and also Israeli human rights leaders, have been under attack by the Israeli government in particular. The Israeli government, particularly the Netanyahu government, also very much went after Israeli human rights leaders and human rights organizations. So it's important to invest in those people, to bring their voices to the table, to lift up their voices, to share pieces that they write, to bring them in as speakers, and to invest financially in their success, because those are the organizations that are the basis for civil society in both societies, hopefully in the future in both countries. And those are the people also who can give us hope. I think sitting here, wherever each of us is sitting, in Boston or New York or any place else, it's very easy to lose hope. But when we look at the people who are on the ground, who are not losing hope, but who are actually working out of hope and who are choosing hope over despair, then that will help us also to believe that a different future is possible.
Thank you, Rabbi Jacobs. Nidal, perhaps you can give us your opening presentation now.
Thank you, Mitchell. Thank you for the organizers for organizing this event. And I also want to thank everybody who's here with us, listening to us in this evening, wherever you are. Thank you for being here. Mitchell, you've asked a lot of good questions that I would love to ask, to discuss, not to answer, to discuss these questions in the questions and answers after my short and brief presentation. And I want to really take this opportunity this evening to talk about 2 things. First, I want to give a quick background about the Aida refugee camp, and then I want to talk briefly about my recent visit to Palestine, to the West Bank, to give you an update about what's going on there, because knowing and understanding what's happening on the ground will help us have a more meaningful discussion to try to talk about the questions that you proposed. So as you heard in the intro, everyone, I was born and raised in the Aida refugee camp. It's one of the 3 refugee camps in the Bethlehem city in the West Bank. And I want to start by giving this short background about the camp, because it shows how people there, as well as in other places across the West Bank, struggling every day with hard conditions, that many of these conditions are caused by the Israeli occupation. And then, as I said, I want to talk about my recent visit to the West Bank, about what I saw, what I witnessed, the things that I was expected to see, but also the things that really shocked me. So quickly, Ada refugee camp is about half square kilometer that hosts around 5,000 refugees. Almost half of them are children under the age of 18 years old. And those refugees were displaced from their original village in 1948. This is when Israel was established, and some during the 1967 war. They live in a place, as actually Angela Davis described after her visit, I think in 2008. She described it as an open air prison. It is an overcrowded place that's surrounded by an 8-meter concrete wall that Israel built around 2 sides of the camp with watchtowers, and surrounded by also an Israeli military base. And one opening to 2 major cities in Bethlehem, which is Bethlehem, Beit Jala city. It is crowded where you can actually cross half of the camp without walking the street. This is how close houses to each other are. It suffers from lack of space for children to play. There's no way to expand geographically. It has a major water crisis, especially in the summer, because due to Israel control over Palestinian water in the West Bank. It suffers from almost a daily army presence who come to arrest, to search houses in the middle of the night, and use different kind of arms, to the point where, based on the UC Berkeley School of Law research on the use of tear gas in the world, they found out that Aida refugee camp is the highest recipient of tear gas in the world. I, who grew up there and lived most of my life there, I knew that, but I knew there was like a lot of tear gas that being thrown by the Israeli army on people, but not to the point where Aida refugee camp is the highest recipient of tear gas in the world. So, and this happens when the Israeli army comes to the camp and start firing hundreds of tear gas canisters into the people, along with other different type of ammunitions. And where this tear gas comes, actually, it comes from Pennsylvania. So it being manufactured in Pennsylvania here in the US, sent to Israel to be used on the people and communities there in Palestine. And every tear gas canister, actually, it's stamped with, in English, made in USA, and the address of the factory in Pennsylvania. So really, I'm saying this also to show that when an Israeli soldier comes to these Palestinian communities equipped with M16, tear gas, live ammunitions, etc., and in many of these equipments stamped in English, made in USA, this is how the Palestinian people understand the US foreign policy in the Middle East. It is through urbanizing and arming groups and armies there. And all of that happens in Aida refugee camp while the Israeli settlers are enjoying a very comfortable life 10 minutes away, 10 minutes walking, from Aida camp in Ghetto settlements. Aida, as well as many areas in the West Bank, is, I would say, it is a place where peace, reconciliation, etc., really do not mean a lot to people, unfortunately. And I can't talk to you about why it doesn't mean a lot to people there in our discussion. So this is where I was born, and this is where I lived most of my life. This is where my mother and much of my brothers and their families are still living there. So let's keep in mind that I am a Palestinian American who is not in solidarity with Palestinians, because it makes me feel funny that to be in solidarity with myself. but I am part of the society there. I am part of the struggle for freedom and justice in Palestine. So I want to shift to give you a quick update also about my recent visit to Palestine. After almost a year and a half due to COVID, I haven't been able to travel there. So I finally managed to travel to Palestine to see my family and to check in with communities in the refugee camps we serve through our project we run through 143 organization. So what I have seen and what I have witnessed was shocking. Things that I expected, such as the ongoing infrastructure for illegal Israeli settlements across the West Bank. Yet I was shocked by how fast they are working on that. The number of hills and roads that are being dug to connect these settlements together, the new settlements, the expansion on the existing settlements, the amount of land that being taken for that is huge. It is fragmenting the villages, the towns, the cities in the West Bank, and making it impossible to have any type of geographic connection between these areas. I mean, also I was shocked by, the number of farmland that being taken away from farmers and the number of farmland that farmers cannot access is huge, because these infrastructures and settlement activities are considered to be as security zones where Palestinians actually cannot come close to them. The displacement of communities who have been living in their lands for decades, such as in the Jordan Valley, in the Hebron Hills, in Jerusalem area also, the loss of natural resources and water comes along with the settler activities, etc., etc. What I felt witnessing all of this, and it is like the feeling in Palestine right now. It is making the Nakba, the catastrophe that happens in 1948, it's making it alive. It is making it as not an event that happened and ended. All these practices by Israeli occupation and more is making it ongoing. And there's actually an expression among Palestinian communities that the Nakba is ongoing. It's still going until today. What also shocked me is the amount of power that Israel is giving to the settlers in the West Bank to attack communities and farmers, burn trees, block roads, occupy houses, and force their families to leave their houses and more. And everything is done under the protection of the Israeli army for these settlers. The level of incarcerated young Palestinians in Israeli jail without charges is just huge. And this is done based on the Israeli law, the administrative detention law. This law, by the way, was a British law. Palestine was colonized by the British for 28 years. And when they left and Israel was established, the Israeli government kept some of their laws. And one of them is the administrative law, detention law. Where it gives the court, the Israeli court, the military Israeli court, the right to detain Palestinians without charges. The huge is just, this is the number of people who, especially the young people who have been arrested and put in jail without charges is really huge. And this has huge impact on the Palestinian communities and on the society in general. And also I will be happy to talk up more about it if there's time at the end. What I also have noticed in the West Bank, which also contribute to all of the questions that raised to start having this discussion at the end, is the unemployment in Palestine is way up. And this is due to the broken economical system, because Israel is in control of everything. And because the Palestinian Authority operates on funds and donations, and add into that COVID in the past year and a half or 2 years has contributed to a lot of job loss, poverty in the rise, unemployment, etc., etc. And along with that comes the number of graduate students without jobs is really shocking. And here we are talking about a whole generation whom their families spend so much money to help them get through college. And now they are desperately looking for any job, and there is not much job going on left in the West Bank. And on top of all of that, Israel is really moving with full speed in grabbing as much land as they can, force communities out of their areas, build settlements, oppress, kill, arrest, destroy, whatever they can, without even listening to any criticism, actually to their own criticism that are coming from the civil and human rights organizations that are describing their practices in the West Bank and Gaza Strip as apartheid, or anything that comes from the international community. And this really, I mean, to the point where ministers and prime ministers will come and start accusing Palestinian civil society organizations as being terrorists. These are like organizations that provide help for children, for farmers, for families, for things just to keep going with this. To conclude, because we don't have much time, I see Mitchell looking at me, but I also witnessed the steadfastness among many communities in the West Bank, and the insistence by Palestinians that life goes on, and the struggle and the resistance with whatever they have and can do, making me, as a Palestinian who live in the diaspora, hopeful, and keeping me doing whatever I can to support these communities. You know, as an old woman told me during my visit from Batir village, I was talking with her about the Nakba and this time, and she was telling me that, listen, what happened in the Nakba, what's happening right now is actually worse than what happened in the Nakba. And this really shocked me to hear this Nakba survival telling me about these things. And this tells me and tells us about how bad the situation is. But I have to say that the daily oppression by the occupation, the amount of pressure and the hardship that Palestinian communities are facing every day will lead us into another explosion. What is it? What is the size of it? The shape of it? I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. I have much to say, and I have looking forward to answer Mitchell, not to answer, to discuss Mitchell questions, but I will stop here and leave it to you, Mitchell.
Thank you, Nidal. Nidal, I think you painted a very strong picture that many of us are familiar with, but you fleshed it out vividly about the human rights violation that Rabbi Jacobs' organization is so concerned with. And Rabbi Jacobs, it strikes me that you also vividly discussed how Trua is trying to intervene on the basis of human rights and how what you're doing on the ground. What I'm wondering is, from both of your perspectives, how can Americans, American Jews specifically, or American Muslims, but really any Americans that are seized by what is going on, I want to ask, what can they do? But I want to make it a bit more concrete. First of all, who should people that already consider themselves activists, who should they seek to organize? Who's the group you think that is reachable, whether it's diaspora Palestinians, whether it's American Jews, or just American progressives? Who should they try to organize, and what should they try and organize them to do concretely? Obviously, financial support for people on the ground, as you both are and work with, is always welcome. And maybe that is the most important thing that can be done. But for people that want to do something either in addition or don't have the resources to be financially supportive, what kind of political work do you see being done to the end of stopping the violation of human rights, stopping the miseries and the blighted lives that you so well described? And of course, having heard each other, if you want to raise other questions to the other speaker, feel free to do so. But if you could address that. we'll, I guess, go to you, Rabbi Jacobs, now, and then back to Nidal.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Nidal, thank you so much for sharing that really just painful experience. I've been to the Aida camp a number of times, and I could see it very vividly again in my head while you were talking about it. Here's one very concrete thing that everybody in this call can do. Well, so first of all, I want to answer your question about who should you organize. The answer is you can only organize your own community. So I know that I don't know most of the people on this call, but I know we're all in different communities, different religious communities, geographic communities. You can only organize within your own community. So whatever community you're in, that's who you can be organizing. So one very concrete thing that everybody can do, at least assuming that everybody is living in the US who's on this call. So one of Torah's main legislative priorities when it comes to Israel for this year is supporting the Two-State Solution Act, which was introduced by Representative Andy Levin. And it is an act that has real teeth. So if it passes, which there's a long road to there, but it very specifically, first, it clarifies the difference between Israel inside of the Green Line and the West Bank. So that's reversing some of the policies of the Trump administration that said it's all the same thing. There's no difference between the areas under occupation and inside of Israel. It puts into place oversight over money that goes to Israel to ensure that it's not used for activities that perpetuate occupation, that expand annexation. It puts real money into human rights and civil society groups on the ground, so groups that are working on democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. It strengthens money that will strengthen civil society organizations, which is going to be especially important if, hopefully as the Palestinians move toward their own state, God willing, that to have a very strong civil society. And also it starts to put some things in place that will end the designation of the PLO as a terrorist organization, which has been as something that has negative implications. So it's an act that has real teeth. So something that all of us can do is we can look up whether our own representatives are already signed on as co-sponsors. If you go to Representative Andy Levin's page, he's the main co-sponsor. You can see who else is co-sponsoring it, and you can either call your representative's office to say, can you please also co-sponsor it, or to say, thank you so much, that means a lot to us. So that's something very concrete that everybody who lives in this country can do.
Thank you. Nidal?
This is a great question, because I look at it from 2 or 3 perspectives. One is, I'm sure many of the viewers are Jewish, and we have people who are listening to us from different walks of lives. But specifically for the Jewish communities here in the US, they have dual responsibilities. One, everything Israel is doing in Israel is doing it in the name of Jewish people and for the Jewish people, not only the ones are in Israel, but everywhere in the world. So this is really both a responsibility on the Jewish communities to really send a clear message to Israel that that's not the case, unless many Jewish communities are supportive of Israel, but I know that many Jewish organizations, communities who are not okay with what Israel is doing there. So, and for being Jewish and American, you have a double responsibility here to be politically organized. For me as a Palestinian, and for many of the Palestinians I know in the US, we have a huge responsibility toward our people back home. So a lot of our energy goes to Palestine and back home, and we are part of the solidarity groups, and we are part of the delegations and the political activism here in the US. But really, for much of the people here who are listening to us, who are Americans, who are their tax dollars are actually contributing to the miserable situation that Palestinians are facing there. We have if we look around our community, if we look in our community, I want to give, for example, the Boston area. your responsibility, our responsibility here in the US is to be politically organized and politically active to force the US to work in forcing the US to change their policy and foreign policy in the Middle East, especially in Israel and Palestine. And this it could be done by organizing yourself as a community. And if you don't have the experience in organizing yourself as a community, there are a lot of groups and organizations who are actively doing this work. Just quickly, I can tell people here in the Boston area to go check the work that Mass Peace Action is doing, the Alliance Water for Justice, the Jewish Voice for Peace, and many other organizations who are really doing a great job in keeping the state representatives, the Congress people, the governors, and everybody who's doing political work from an educational perspective on Israel-Palestine, from stopping these delegations that are going there, etc., etc. The other piece, quickly, to see that as an American who live in this country, who your tax dollars is contributing to there, and from a moral and a human rights perspective, we have to keep the pressure on the US government to change their policies and not to interfere a lot in what's happening in the ground in Palestine, because this has to be left really for the Palestinians and for whoever lived there to figure out. Your responsibility, I see it as being more effective, is being mobilized and organized to do a lot of political work here in the US.
Great. I have one follow-up question. Rabbi Jacobs, you mentioned supporting Andy Levin's legislation, which is specifically aimed at two states. To what extent can one be an activist? Because obviously, two states has become controversial in various communities and among, my understanding, among Palestinians, certainly among Jews. To what extent can one be agnostic? Perhaps not the right term, but one not commit oneself to what the ultimate political form that will bring an end to human rights violations, an end to injustices to both peoples and to individuals there, and still be active? Or does any kind of activity implicitly require one to envision what one thinks would be the just solution and is politically possible? And I wonder if you both could talk about to what extent are political questions of status, ultimate status, separable from activism, or is the nature of one's activism get colored by what one envisions as the end state? I'm not sure if that was clear, but I hope it was clear enough for you to make something out of it. Rabbi Jacobs, and then we'll go back to Nidal.
Well, ultimately, the parties on the ground are going to have to negotiate what a solution will be that, as I said, has to be based in the human rights of both people, that everybody's going to have citizenship in a country, freedom of movement, et cetera, et cetera. So that the parties on the ground have to negotiate that. Now, right now, Israel officially has a two-state position, but obviously Netanyahu at least backed off of that, and the actions on the ground in terms of expanding settlements show that there's not actually a commitment to it. The PA and the PLO still have a two-state solution, still have a two-state position. Hamas in the past has said they would at least accept it, right? So there's some polling that's come out. Basically there's mixed feelings on the ground among both Israelis and Palestinians. I don't think you can say everybody in Israel or everybody in Palestine believes this, that, or the other thing, but there's still at least significant support on the ground, including in the political bodies of the Palestinians, for two states. That said, if the two parties come together and negotiate a binational state or a single state, right? That's for them to negotiate. If they negotiate two states now and in 50 years it's one state, whatever it is, it's for them to negotiate. So we can all say what we think the most likely the most likely solution is, but it's for the parties on the ground to actually negotiate in the end. I don't think, human rights organizations are by definition not political. So we do take a two-state position, but we're more focused on the human rights on the ground than on the particular political solution. Now, I will say the Two-State Act, I know not everybody agrees with two states or not two states. That is US policy. And so what this act is doing is it's actually forcing the US to act on its policy of many decades, minus the Trump administration when the policy shifted, but to act on long-term US policy. And so it's, if this act passes, there's not going to be two states tomorrow in Israel and Palestine, because that's not the way things work, but it does have some teeth in terms of making concrete changes in the ground that will have an actual impact on people, no matter what the final political solution is.
Nidal?
Again, another great question. And the way I look at it really, throughout my life that I lived in Palestine and my work with Palestinian communities in the past 15, 16 years, especially in refugee camps with refugee populations, and being here, living here in the US and work with international communities and groups and activists, the way I look at it is really we need to pause and look at the situation. We have to learn from the previous lessons. For example, we all, when we look at what happened in Oslo Agreement, for example, in 1993-94, when Oslo peace process came, and we look at where we are now for Palestine, from the Palestinian perspective, I'm talking right now, is when you talk to Palestinians about, hey, what do you think about peace? What do you think about one state or two states? At least from the communities that I work with, which I always have this discussion with them. There's no discussion about that because this visa process that was brought to them without a foundation, was built on, there was no a foundation for this peace process, and the foundation for Palestinians means justice and equality. So if we need to really talk about a solution, the solution has to have justice, has to have equality for the Palestinians and for everybody who live there. So at the same time, when they look at the international community, more the politicians and government-wise, the way they look at our situation, in our case, they go around the problem. They don't face the problem. The way we look at it, and the way as Palestinians, if you really want to work with any group, with anyone who is interested in solving and finding a just solution, we have to acknowledge what's happening on the ground. We have to face it, and we have to break it to a million pieces to look at it, and then really build a strong foundation for it, which is based on justice and equality. For me, as Palestinian, my family comes from 1948. All right. So the two-state solution, which I'm just feeling like, even the saying the two-state solution based on our knowledge of what's happening in the West Bank is really, I don't think Israel is gonna oblige to the two-state solution or one state or whatever. But for me, if Israel even did the two-state solution, what's going to happen to the Palestinians who were displaced in 1948? What's going to happen to the Palestinians who live in Jordan, that 12 recognized refugee camps in Lebanon, this and that? When we say about the term solution, like, what kind of a solution? No, we have a lot of homework, and we have a groundwork, and we have to get educated, and we have to really look at everything before we really look at a new proposal or suggest a new solution. So this is a really tough and complicated area.
Okay, from looking at some of the questions coming in, I see that there's an interest in, and I'm certainly interested in, both of your attitudes to some very specific strategic approaches or tactical, perhaps. One is, what do you think about pressure on the American government, especially given some of the stuff that you pointed out, Nidal, to reduce or even eliminate all financial support to Israel? What do you think would be the pull? First of all, what do you think about that in terms of the justice of such a policy proposal? And furthermore, what do you think about the political effectiveness of such of such a proposal. And there's also great interest in your attitudes towards the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, both the formal movement and the activities of boycotting or calling for sanctions or divestment from Israel from people who may not be, formally associated with that movement. I wonder if you could comment on those two specific strategies or tactics. Looks like you had trouble hearing me, Nidal, right? Did anyone hear me?
Mitchell, I'm so sorry. I didn't hear everything you said. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
And I'm trying to really.
The short summary is, what do you think about politics to cut off American aid to Israel? And what do you think about boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a political tactic? Some people think it's effective. Others think it's actually anti-Zionist and close to anti-Semitic. So there's a broad range of attitudes towards that.
Well, both areas, the BDS movements and the activities and the organizations around the U.S. fund for not only Israel, the U.S. fund for the Saudi Arabia, who's funding Saudi Arabia to destroy Yemen, the U.S. fund for other regions to attack other regions. It all fell into the same basket. And when I look at the BDS movements as a civil nonviolent action, that is really the call that came from the civil society, the Palestinian civil society, to the Palestinians and to the international community to take an action. It is very effective. As I see it, one of the actions that's really effective here in the US and in Europe to really force Israel to change its policy in not only in the occupied territories, but elsewhere. So, as a Palestinians, I'm saying this not to justify an action and not to criminalize other actions. No, as a Palestinian, as Palestinians who we live under occupation and we are in the fight for our freedom and justice, that BDS is one of the tactics that is really having an effective result to force Israel to oblige to that. In terms of the U.S. fund to Israel, I mean, the U.S. fund for Israel, I want to go back to the point is like how much, when you look at the U.S. as a country, when you look at the U.S. as a society, how much is the Americans contributing to that? And how much of this money goes to Israel from each state, from the government and federal fund to Israel? With this fund, as many groups and organizations have been calling, being directed to other causes here in this country or to the states that contributing to Israel to continue with their occupation on the ground in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip or elsewhere. So it's really is a question more to the American communities and to the American people because it's related to their Hello.
Hi. Did we lose Nidal? Oh, there. You're visually back again. Can you hear me, Nidal?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Sorry, I'm back here. I don't know what happened, but I'm back. So just to conclude, and not say much about this topic because it is one of the tactics that is really have been working very well in many areas to force Israel to change their policies in the West Bank. And I think as a call that came from the Palestinian civil society, it should be supported.
Rabbi Jacob?
So first, let me just talk about boycotts out of context, because I think sometimes we get into arguments about BDS as a specific thing. So boycotts are a protected form of free speech that's well established in American law, and boycotts are a tactic among many tactics. So when you're protesting something, right, you might have a rally, you might write letters, you might do advocacy, you might do a boycott, right? There's many tactics that one might use. So just want to, I think sometimes there's a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot of anxiety about BDS, and people talk about BDS, at least in the Jewish community, as if it's its own, it's just taken on a life of its own. And it's important to remember that it's a tactic. The boycotts are always a tactic, and also that they're protected as American free speech. So Torah as an organization does not boycott Israel, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We do, however, very much support other people's right to that form of free speech. So we've actually filed multiple amicus briefs in a number of states that have passed some of these anti-BDS laws, that they're written slightly differently, but essentially that no state contractor, that the state won't do business with anybody who is, in some cases, actively boycotting Israel. Sometimes it also says, and or the territories. Sometimes they actually have to sign something saying they won't. So we've taken on some of those cases. In particular, I'll mention one case in Arkansas that is still, it's now in kind of a new phase of its legal situation, but basically Arkansas passed one of these laws that said that if you're taking state money, you have to sign something saying you won't support boycotts of Israel. And one of the businesses that affected was the Arkansas Times, which is a small local Little Rock newspaper that writes about Little Rock. They're not interested in foreign affairs generally at all. And they, a big part of their ad revenue comes from the University of Arkansas, from one of the branches, one of the campuses. And so the publisher, when he was asked to sign this piece of paper, he said, we don't really care about foreign policy. We don't write about Israel or Palestine. But that said, we're a newspaper, we're not signing away our First Amendment rights. And so that's the case now. It's the Arkansas Times versus the state, and so we're supporting the newspaper. And one of our member rabbis is the rabbi of the largest synagogue in the state, or as he likes to tell me, it's larger than all the other synagogues put together in Little Rock. And he's come out very strongly saying, first, nobody talked to the Jewish community before they introduced this bill. It came from Republican Christian state legislators. Nobody came to talk to him or anybody else. And it's not something the Jewish community wanted. And he's come out very strongly supporting the newspaper. And so we very much stand for free speech. In terms of the question of tactics, again, it's a tactic among many others. So if others want to use that tactic, then that's a decision. One of the reasons that we don't engage in this particular tactic is that we don't actually see it. There's a number of reasons, including that we do have a strong commitment to investing in Israel, particularly in the human rights and civil rights structure, as well as in Palestine and the future state of Palestine. And also we do see that this tactic is actually backfiring, that it becomes an excuse for the state of Israel and for Jewish communities to say, well, that's anti-Semitism, and sometimes to, because it is not anti-Semitic. I want to be clear, it's not anti-Semitic to boycott Israel or any other country. I don't think anybody would, if somebody says, well, I'll say very specifically, Trua is engaged in a campaign to ask clothing companies to stop buying cotton from China because that cotton comes from Xinjiang and is produced by forced labor of the Uyghur people. And so that's a very specific choice. I think when it comes to Israel, even though it's not anti-Semitic to boycott Israel, it does trigger some historic trauma, and it does backfire in that it's easy then for the state of Israel and for some Jewish communities to say, well, that's anti-Semitism, and then to draw a block to basically just put up a wall and not be able to hear what the conversation is or what the situation on the ground is. And it's a way for Israel to say, well, this is proof that everybody really does hate us and everybody is really trying to destroy us, and to circle the wagons and shut everything out. So we actually see it backfiring, but that shouldn't have any impact. Everybody should make their own choice about whether it's a tactic that they're going to participate in. And as I said, we will certainly stand up for the right we'll stand up for the right of anybody to participate in that or any other kind of free speech, including through our legal briefs that we filed. In terms of foreign aid, we are supporters of the McCollum Act, which is calling for transparency in how U.S. aid is used. And so, again, we think that the focus needs to be on ensuring that U.S. aid isn't used to expand settlements, to entrench occupation. But we also acknowledge that Israel does have security issues that are sometimes even not directly connected to the situation, to the occupation, the situation with Palestinians, right? Security concerns about other countries in the region. So we don't want to just take a blunt hammer to all of that, but we do support the specific bill that is the bill that exists right now that would call for transparency in how that money is being used.
If I can just add a little bit here, Mitchell.
Go ahead,
in
Nidal.
regards the BDS and in regards to what everybody can do. This conversation is not only. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people who are participating in this evening are coming again from different walks of life, and some supports BDS, some not, some come from a family who supports Israel, some who's coming from a family who supports Palestine, or in the middle. It's whatever you're comfortable with. The first thing I think we have individual and collective responsibility as communities who live in the U.S., and our tax dollars is contributing to the situation the situation there. And as a Palestinian, I do not expect everybody to be a support of a cause. I think as a Palestinian, I want everybody to be educated and active locally, educated about what's happening there, but also active locally based on what they are comfortable with to act and be responsible when it comes to Israel and Palestine and other cases that the U.S. is involved in the world. In terms of BDS, again,
Nidal, I've lost you. I don't know if other people have.
I'm here back. I'm back now.
You're back. Now you're back.
Okay, good. In terms of the BDS, the BDS movement, when you look at it in the West, is different than when you look at it in Palestine, in the West Bank, or in Jerusalem. It has a different dynamic there due to the geographic interactions and the society interactions between the Palestinian society and the state of Israel. But here in the West, I think we have more flexibility to be active in, as I said, in the BDS movement or other movements, to really make it loud and clear that what's happening there in Israel and Palestine is way overdue, and we have to act. We have to act. We have to send a stronger message to Israel, either through a U.S. foreign policy or through us, that things has to change soon before it's too late, and maybe it is too late.
Well, this entire four series of panel discussions has been premised on it's important to listen to each other. So implicit in that is we're against any efforts to silence any voice, whether through government action or some kind of shutting out from institutions of various perspectives. So I take that as a given, but we also want to know what the content should be. Now, you just mentioned educational efforts, Nidal. I'd like to ask both of you, if there was one sort of specific bit of content that you would like to educate Americans in general about the situation in Israel and Palestine, what do you think it would be important to convey? And if you have any ideas about a format for conveying it that'll get that message through. It's there's a lot of history, there's a lot of perspectives, but what do you think would both be most morally and politically useful if I won't restrict you to one, but one or two actual contents about what's going on that you would like to be more widely known among Americans? Either one of you want to jump in on that?
I would really strongly, the travel restrictions, COVID is easing up in the world, and the travel will, people can travel again hopefully soon. For the situation in Israel and Palestine, especially in the Palestinian areas, is for people who are really interested in grasping a good understanding about the situation there, is to travel there if you can, to spend time on the ground there if you can. And there's a lot of delegations that are happening from the U.S. to the area there. Eyewitness Palestine, and all of these organizations are going to do delegations starting next spring. So please look for that. And if you can afford to go there and your health allow, go and be on the ground. Second, quickly, I will say really strongly, look for alternative news, alternative ways to educate yourself. There's a lot of bias from all sides about Israel, Palestine, and the news that we have here in the US, not the right source to do that. So there's like tons of webinars, tons of writers and historians who writes about Israel, Palestine, Israelis, Jewish, Arab, Palestinians to do that. But the most effective way to learn about the situation is to be there physically.
Rabbi Jacobs, do you have anything to say about that?
I absolutely agree that it's really important to be able to be there physically. If not, I think meeting people and understanding that both Israelis and Palestinians are real people and not just kind of theories or figments of one's imagination or ideas to argue about politically. I think that's really, really important, and particularly to meet the civil society and human rights leaders, as I said before. For those who can't get to the region, there's certainly, thanks to Zoom, there's many other ways to meet people who are working on the ground and to hear their voices or to read what they're writing. So I think that is really, really important. I'll mention one resource that you can find on the TRA website. We have a little booklet about occupation, and it's really accessible. It's like a quarter page, like it's like that big, 20 pages. I'll try to put the link in the chat if I can find it quickly. And it's just a very quick introduction to the international legal definitions. There's a couple of testimonies from a Palestinian woman and from an Israeli, I think both women actually, from an Israeli and a Palestinian. And it's just very, I think, a very quick way to even understand all of the terms that people throw out. And you can either download it, or you can print it, or you can order a physical copy. So I'll stick that in the chat.
Great. Some of our questioners have pointed out that there's a tremendous, and this is obviously true, a tremendous power imbalance between Israelis and Palestinians at this point, especially given where the United States has been positioning itself in most recent years. And people are wondering whether there are international organizations that you think, given the power imbalance, could usefully and effectively intervene. Do you see a role for the United Nations or any other governmental or non-governmental international organizations that you think could be useful players in bringing about respect for human rights and justice to Israel and Palestine?
That is a tough question for me as a Palestinian refugee who grew up in Aida refugee camp. And why? This is how we as Palestinians, I'm not generalizing, Palestinians have different opinions, but at least me, my family, the communities I work with, I grew up with, look at the international community when it comes to Israel and Palestine, when it comes to Palestine. When Aida refugee camp was established in 1950, 1951, the United Nations, the UNRWA, came and rented and just established the camp, soon after the Nakba. And practically they rented the land for 99 years from the Christians who live in Bethlehem city without telling the refugees. And actually, in the beginning, they told refugees, no, you're going back based on the 194 United Nations resolutions. It gives you the right as a refugee to go back for. And from that point up until all these treaties and agreements and negotiations, Palestinians have really, their relationship with the international community has been shaking. Like it's really the gap and the distrust is really huge. What I think as a Palestinian who involved in Palestinian communities and here is us who are here taking the time to listen, the human rights organizations and the groups and the activists, the ones who are really contributing their time and their energy and their money to seriously wants to make a difference there and to find a just solution there is the way to go for me as a Palestinian. This is the way I look at it.
I mean, my short answer is we won't know until something works. That said, there's obviously a lot of players who have tried to be involved, whether it's the US or the UN or the Quartet or the EU or, I mean, the Arab peace deal or whatever you want to call it, peace plan is, I think, still on the table. So there's lots of, the Arab League, there's lots of people who have tried to, or lots of international countries and international organizations that have tried to be involved. As Nidal said, so far it hasn't worked, but I certainly think that it's important for different organizations and countries around the world to be involved. And I don't know, I can't predict the future. I don't know what, if anything, will work. I don't know who can have an impact. I agree that it's the people on the ground ultimately who are going to bring about the solutions, but I don't think that there's a reason to not try to involve the international community.
You both have spoken a number of times about the importance of what's going on the ground. And one of the obvious things that's been going on for the decades, but seems to have accelerated in most recent years, is settlement activity. Is there something specific that you think activists can do to both highlight what's going on in expanded settlements and highlight what the settlements do in terms of contributing to human rights violation and to putting justice in the land even further off? What specific activities do you see inhibiting, not only inhibiting, but stopping, if not reversing, some of this settlement activity that's been so nefarious? Rabbi Jacobs, let's start with you now, and then we'll go to you, Nidal.
Yeah, I mean, as everybody has heard, just the expansion of settlements is just choking the West Bank, the Area C of the West Bank where the settlements are. And I mean, we see just existing settlements growing. We see outposts popping up. We see lots of Palestinian land being taken by those settlements and by buffer zones around settlements, as well as by closed military zones, which are not technically settlements, but effectively are having a similar impact. So my answer depends a bit on where any of us sit. And again, there's a range of people on the call. So I think that it is important to be talking to our representatives, our US representatives, about our concern about the expansion of settlements and the destruction and evacuation of Palestinian villages. I think that's a conversation we should be having with our US representatives, because it is important that, and we know that the State Department, that Israel is concerned about what the State Department has to say. So I think that is important. I think for those of us in the Jewish community, we can look at the organizations that we're involved in, particularly organizations that are putting money into Israel and pushing them to not put money into the settlements, and just pushing against the tendency to erase the line between what's inside of Israel according to international boundaries and what settlements. So I think that we can, to push for, as I mentioned, the legislation that would reverse some of the Trump administration's moves to just erase that line altogether, to be able to clearly label products, for example, what comes from Israel, what comes from the settlement. So those are some concrete things we can do, and to continue to insist on that. And I would say, particularly to those of us in the Jewish community who sometimes there's this language around so-called consensus settlements, like sort of the established settlements, places like Efrat, where a lot of American Jews have family and friends, and to just be really clear whenever we're talking about settlements that according to international law, all settlements are illegal. So even ones that have been there for a long time, even ones where your cousins live and they're nice people, just they're all illegal according to international law. And even ones, in the various maps that have flown around in all the various peace negotiations, there's always land swaps. And some of those settlements that are closer in to Jerusalem have been suggested to be part of Israel, but that doesn't mean there's no peace agreement, which means there's no consensus. You need two people to have a consensus, or two countries to have a consensus. And so it's just really important to insist that those are not consensus settlements, because there's actually no consensus. They're settlements. All of them are settlements.
Yeah, this is great. But I also I see it very important for activists, for advocates, for organizations to be updated. I haven't been to Palestine for a year and a half. And I used to go once or twice, sometimes 3 times, because of my work there. And this year and a half, the changes on the ground is just shocking. The expansions of settlements, the roads. And it's very important for us to be updated and have accurate numbers and accurate information to be presented in our delegations to our representatives. And it's very important also to understand and to learn how the settlements and the roads work and how they affect Palestinian lives. Quick example: when you build a small settlement on top of a mountain or a hill, all this hill or this mountain will be taken for security reason. When you connect settlements with satellite roads with each other and into a 48 green line, these roads on both sides are security zone. So the land that is being lost for these roads that Palestinian farmers cannot use, and the land that's the hills are taken by the settlements, putting the Palestinian communities in a high risk. And also we need to understand how these settlements are fragmenting, the Palestinian communities. And for people who believe in the 2 states, which not me, but if you're an advocate for the 2 states, this is a killing of this 2-state solution, because Palestinians right now live on only around 8-9% of the 22% of the West Bank. So, and this 8 or 9% is not one unit; it's fragmented. If you want to go from Bethlehem to Hebron, from Bethlehem to Ramallah, you need to pass through settlements and settler roads, etc., etc., etc. So we need to be updated, educated, understand how the system works, and get a lot of accurate data and accurate information to strengthen our argument and discussions with our representatives and elsewhere.
Great. We're approaching the end of this evening, so I'd like you to be brief. But I'm going to give you a question that's difficult to be brief with. Given how bleak many of us have felt about developments in recent years, decades, or centuries for that matter, in some matters, what gives you hope? What gives you reason to hope? And I guess I'm assuming that you are hopeful. But if you could briefly leave us with what motivates you to keep going in your work and keeps you hopeful. Nidal first, and then Rabbi Jacobs.
Wow, what a question. You saved this question till the end. Through my work, through 143, we run these projects like health projects, environmental projects, food, like through agriculture, early child education, like kindergartens. And the communities that I work with in Palestine, who live under such extreme hardship, like really, really difficult situation there. And each time I visit them, each time I talk to them, each time I visit, I take people to do work there, and I see how insistent they are. I see how they're determined to keep the projects going, to serve these young people who we employ to serve their communities, to see how they are holding on every single beautiful moments in their life and make it big, keeps me going. The people on the ground in Palestine keeps me going. The people on the ground in Palestine keeps, quote unquote, my hope or the hope alive. It keeps me doing what I do, and hopefully, you know, things will get better soon. And for travel wise, that anybody who's really interested in really seeing these things on the ground and being involved in this project, just get in touch.
Jill, Rabbi Jacobs.
My answer is the same, and it won't surprise anyone, I don't think, because it's been a theme of the evening. But yes, it's the people on the ground who are fighting for their own lives and for their future. I'll say also, as a Jew, Jewish history takes the long view, right? Jewish history, there's been lots of ups and downs, and maybe very low downs and slightly higher ups, but not probably very high. But we're always looking toward the Messianic age, and that's what's sustained our people for thousands of years, that have included lots of expulsions and persecutions and mass murders, etc. Is looking, is believing that something better can come, even if we're not going to see it in our lifetime or our children's lifetime. And so I really think that it's important to take that long view, to believe that we're part of getting somewhere that, God willing, we will see, but it's possible that we won't. And the people on the ground don't have the choice to just say, sorry, I give up. This isn't interesting anymore. Let me go work on something else. And the people who are choosing, even in very difficult situations, to not give in to despair, but to do their activist work out of hope, give me hope also. And also force, I feel like they obligate me to partner with them and to not give up hope, but to move forward.
Great. Thank you both. I want to conclude by saying that a lot of important organizations and legislation of interest has been mentioned tonight. I'm hopeful we can get that into the chat. If we can't get into the chat, I expect we'll be able to make something like that available, at least on the Boston Workers Circle website. And if the Islamic Council of New England has a website, perhaps it could be there too. Thank you very much, Nidal, Al-Azraq, and Rabbi Jill Jacobs, for a stimulating discussion. And thanks to the two sponsoring organizations and other organizations that have been sponsoring along with the Islamic Council of New England, the Boston Workers Circle. My hope is that this series has deepened understanding of what's going on in Israel, Palestine, but not just for understanding's sake. Understanding for the sake of guiding intelligent and effective action to bring about a vision that I think we all share, perhaps in different political forms, of the end of human rights violations and a politically just solution, or if not solution, getting to a more just state all the time. So I keep that hope, because history has proven to be surprising and give us unexpected things. I've lived to see things that I never thought I would live to see. But I think those unexpected changes often happen because there are people who, against all the odds, expect it and work towards it and retain hope with it. And so I hope this series has contributed to that. I want to thank all the organizers behind the scenes, all the previous panelists, and tonight's panelists for contributing in this dialogue, a dialogue for the sake of heaven, I think. And I'm someone who's quite skeptical about heaven, but I still act that way. Thank you very much. Good night to everyone. And once again, thank you for participating.